In the dimness of a bland everyday life, Carolina dragged her days with the poignant feeling of living a borrowed life, devoid of that sparkle that once glittered in her youthful dreams. Her marriage to Eduardo, once a promising bond of affection and complicity, had faded into a lukewarm and indifferent routine, like a flickering flame at the mercy of a cold breeze. The words exchanged between them had lost their freshness, replaced by a heavy silence that echoed the growing distance in their hearts. The gestures, once filled with tenderness, had become mechanical, stripped of the spontaneity that had nourished the early years of their union. Carolina felt like a spectator of her own existence, trapped in a vicious cycle of obligations and others' expectations, unable to glimpse a horizon that beckoned her with the promise of renewal. The house they lived in, once a nest of happiness and shared plans, now felt like a prison of invisible walls, suffocating any remnants of enthusiasm. The objects that adorned it, witnesses to happy moments, seemed to carry the weight of monotony, constantly reminding her of the contrast between the vibrant past and the faded present. The nights dragged on in insomnia, populated by vague longings and the persistent feeling that something fundamental was missing from her life. She questioned the purpose of her days, the meaning of her choices, but the answers always seemed elusive, shrouded in a fog of uncertainty. At work, the bureaucratic and repetitive routine contributed to her state of apathy. The tasks, once challenging, had become tedious, and the interaction with colleagues, once stimulating, now felt superficial and empty. Carolina yearned for a project that would ignite her passion, for a challenge that would make her feel alive and productive, but her attempts to find something that motivated her stumbled against a barrier of disinterest and lack of opportunities. The feeling of merely going through the motions, waiting for the end of the workday, became increasingly oppressive. In her moments of introspection, Carolina found herself reliving memories from childhood and youth, times when life seemed full of possibilities and promises. She recalled the dreams she cherished, the ambitions that drove her, and felt a mix of nostalgia and frustration upon realizing the chasm between what she had envisioned for herself and the reality in which she found herself. The sensation of having lost herself at some point along the way was constant, eroding her self-esteem and feeding a sense of inadequacy. The rare social occasions were met by Carolina with a mix of obligation and discouragement. The trivial conversations forced laughter, and the superficiality of the gatherings only accentuated her inner isolation. She felt like a stranger in the midst of the crowd, unable to share the apparent joy of others or to find a point of genuine identification. The longing for deeper, more meaningful connections was constant, but the barrier of her own dissatisfaction seemed to prevent her from opening up to new experiences and relationships. The reflection in the mirror returned the image of a face marked by sadness and fatigue, distant from the liveliness that once illuminated it. Her eyes, once expressive and curious, now carried a veil of melancholy, reflecting the aridity of her soul. Carolina saw herself aging prematurely, not just in physical appearance but also in spirit, as if life itself was slowly draining away, leaving behind only a trail of discontent. She yearned for a spark to reignite the flame of hope, for a wind to dissipate the fog of her unhappiness, but the future seemed to her an uncertain and bleak horizon. The routine, relentless in its monotonous cadence, appeared destined to perpetuate that cycle of dissatisfaction, trapping her in a faded existence with no prospects for renewal. Amid the heavy atmosphere of her colorless routine, an unexpected event shook the stagnation of Carolina's life, like a bolt of lightning in a serene sky. The news arrived suddenly and painfully. Her grandmother, Esther, the matriarch of the family and a figure of great importance in her affectionate memories, had passed away. A wave of sadness washed over her, a mix of nostalgia for her grandmother's loving presence and the acknowledgement of life's fragility. Esther had always been a beacon in her life, a source of wisdom and unconditional love, and her absence would leave an immeasurable void. Along with the inevitable pain of mourning, a twist emerged that Carolina could never have predicted. Amid the bureaucratic procedures and the organization of Esther's belongings, the family discovered the existence of a will. The news spread like a whisper among relatives, laden with a mix of curiosity and expectation. For Carolina, the mention of the will brought with it a vague sense that perhaps in that moment of loss there might also be the seed of a new direction, even though she didn't quite know what to expect. The reading of the will was marked by a tense and silent atmosphere. Family members gathered, each with their own hopes and speculations about what Esther had decided for her legacy. Carolina, sitting in a corner, observed the movement with a tight heart, more focused on the affectionate memory of her grandmother than on any material expectations. She remembered her tight hugs, her wise advice, and her welcoming smile, and felt that no inheritance could ever replace her presence. Then came the surprising revelation. Esther had left Carolina an old house, located in Santa Lucia, a small town in the countryside. The property, seemingly modest and in need of repairs, did not spark the same enthusiasm in the other heirs, who likely expected assets of greater financial value. For Carolina, the news was met with a mix of strangeness and a slight thread of curiosity. She wondered why her grandmother had chosen that very house to leave to her, what the meaning of that unexpected gesture could be. Eduardo, on his part, could not hide his disappointment. He had hoped for an inheritance that could bring financial relief to the couple, or perhaps provide them with a more comfortable life. The news of the old house in the countryside deeply irritated him. In a fit of rage, exacerbated by the frustration of his expectations, he hurled cruel words at Carolina, calling her useless and kicking her out of the house they shared. The words, heavy with resentment and contempt, hit Carolina like a physical blow, leaving her stunned and with a shattered heart. That painful moment marked the definitive rupture of a marriage that was already on the brink of collapse, sealing the end of a chapter in her life and abruptly and unexpectedly pushing her onto a new and uncertain path. Alone and helpless, Carolina faced the prospect of the inherited house, the only place that, in that moment of turmoil, seemed to offer her shelter, however uncertain and unknown it might be. Esther's inheritance, which initially seemed like a simple gift, was transforming in that moment of pain and rejection into her only safe harbor, the starting point for a journey she had never imagined she would take. Eduardo's cruel words still echoed in her mind, sharp as shards of glass, as Carolina found herself outside the door she had called home for years. The weight of humiliation and rejection paralyzed her for a moment, leaving her suspended in a void of disbelief. The world she knew, with its foundations already shaken, had just completely crumbled. With a single suitcase containing clothes and fragments of a life that was no longer hers, she felt like a loose leaf in the wind, aimless, without an anchor. The city around her, with its incessant noise and cold lights, had never seemed so hostile and indifferent. Every anonymous face that passed by seemed to accentuate her overwhelming loneliness. The only thread of hope, however thin it was the key she clutched in her palm. Cold and solid, it was the tangible proof of her inheritance, the only asset she had left, Santa Lucia. The name sounded distant, almost mythical, a place visited only a few times in childhood, whose memories were clouded by time. She vaguely remembered the smell of wet earth, the chirping of birds at dawn, and the warm smile of her grandmother Esther, who seemed to have an intrinsic connection to that piece of land. It was this memory, this faint warmth amid the cold of abandonment, that propelled her to act. The bus journey was long and silent, a moving purgatory. The urban landscape, with its grey buildings and oppressive haste, slowly gave way to green fields and gentle hills. For Carolina, it felt as if she was crossing a portal, leaving behind not just a geography, but the person she had been. With every kilometre travelled, she felt the weight of the past dissipate a little, not as an immediate relief, but as the slow shedding of an old, tight skin. The pain was still there, throbbing in her chest, but now it mingled with an unknown sensation, a kind of fearful curiosity about what awaited her at the end of that road. Upon disembarking at the small bus station in Santa Lucia, Carolina breathed in a different air. It was purer, laden with the scent of flowers and greenery. The rhythm of the city was visibly different. There was no frantic rush, no impatient horns or hurried crowds. People walked calmly, greeting each other on the street, and the silence was filled with the sounds of nature. She felt like an outsider, her urban attire and expression of helplessness contrasting with the serenity of the place. With the address written on a crumpled piece of paper, she began to walk. The house was not far away. As she walked along the cobblestone streets, she observed the simple houses with their well-kept gardens, open windows, and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. The sight of the inherited property emerged at the end of a quiet, tree-lined street. It was exactly as she had imagined, and yet the sight impacted her. The house was old, with a wooden porch that looked weary from time and paint, faded by sun and rain. A rusty iron gate guarded a garden that had become wild. Weeds competed for space with stubborn rose bushes and other plants she couldn't name, a tangle of neglected life that somehow reflected her own inner state. With her heart pounding, she pushed the gate, which creaked in protest. She crossed the stone path, feeling the curious gaze of a neighbor through the hedge. She stopped in front of the main door. The wood was worn, but sturdy. She took a deep breath, the smell of dust and old wood already present. She inserted the key into the lock. The metallic sound turning seemed to echo, not only in the stillness of the street, but within her own soul. It was the sound of a new beginning, frightening and irrevocable. The door opened, revealing the dimness of an interior that held time in suspension. Furniture covered with white sheets looked like sleeping ghosts. Dust danced in the beams of light that entered through cracks in the windows. And, floating in the air, an almost imperceptible but unmistakable aroma. A mix of dried herbs, earth, and memories. There, standing at the threshold of her new and only refuge, Carolina felt the weight of all her losses, but also, for the first time in many years, the sensation of owning something that was truly hers. Carolina closed the door behind her, and the sound of the latch clicking seemed to seal her decision, definitively separating her from the world she had left behind. The silence of the house enveloped her, a dense, palpable silence that was not empty, but filled with decades of life and untold stories. The air was still, heavy with the scent of old wood, dust, and that persistent herbal aroma, which now, in the enclosed space, became sharper, almost like an invisible presence. She set her suitcase down on the floor, the only object connecting her to her previous existence, and felt like an archaeologist about to explore a sacred ruin. Her first steps on the wide plank floor echoed through the space. Driven by an impulse, she approached what appeared to be a sofa and pulled the white sheet covering it. Dust rose in a golden cloud under the light, filtering through the window's cracks. It revealed a worn velvet upholstery, adorned with a faded floral pattern. Carolina ran her hand over the fabric, imagining her grandmother sitting there, perhaps reading a book or simply gazing out the window. Each object seemed to whisper fragments of the past, and she felt like an intruder, and at the same time the rightful heir to that forgotten realm. She continued her exploration, moving slowly through the rooms. The living room opened into a small kitchen, and it was there that the herbal aroma intensified, guiding her like an invisible thread. The kitchen was the pulsating heart of the house, even in its dormant state. Copper and iron utensils hung from a rack on the wall, and on a solid wood countertop, the dust of sunlight revealed a series of ceramic and glass jars. It was as she approached that her heart leapt. There were dozens of them, of various sizes and shapes, each with a handwritten label in elegant, firm handwriting that she immediately recognized as her grandmother's. Chamomile, rosemary, lavender, peppermint, lemon balm. The names danced before her eyes, a vocabulary of healing and comfort. Beside the jars, neatly stacked, was the true crown jewel, a collection of well-worn hardcover notebooks. Curiosity overcame hesitation. Carolina picked up the notebook from the top. The cover was soft, dark leather. Upon opening it, she was greeted by the same handwriting as the labels. There were pages and pages filled with notes, detailed drawings of plants, recipes for teas, infusions, ointments, and syrups. There were observations about the phases of the moon for harvesting, notes on the properties of each herb, and small stories and personal reflections from her grandmother. It was not just a recipe book, it was the diary of a life, a testament to folk wisdom and a deep connection to nature. Carolina felt the tears welling up. That inheritance, which had seemed so insignificant to Eduardo, was, in fact, a treasure of immeasurable value. It was the legacy of her grandmother's soul. Absorbed in that universe of discoveries, she was startled by soft knocks on the front door. She hesitated for a moment. Who could it be? Cautiously, she returned to the entrance and opened the door. Before her stood a lady with white hair, tied up in a loose bun, and a smile so genuine and warm that it immediately dispelled any apprehension. Her eyes, though marked by time, sparkled with a contagious liveliness. "You must be Carolina, the granddaughter of our dear Esther," the woman said with a sweet and melodic voice. "I am Lucia, your neighbor. I saw the light and imagined it was you. Welcome, my dear." Aunt Lucia's words, as Carolina would instinctively call her, were like a balm. In an instant, the loneliness that oppressed her gave way to a wave of human warmth. Lucia did not wait for an invitation to enter, bringing with her a basket of fresh bread and a coffee pot. She explained that she had been friends with Esther for over 50 years, and that she felt the house empty since her departure. She shared stories about her grandmother, about how she was sought after by everyone in town for her miraculous teas and wise advice. With the naturalness of someone sharing a precious secret, Lucia confirmed what Carolina was beginning to suspect. That house was not just a dwelling, it was a sanctuary of healing and knowledge. And Esther was not just a grandmother. She was a guardian of that wisdom, standing amidst the dust and ghosts of the past, holding her grandmother's notebook and smelling Lucia's coffee. Carolina understood that she had not arrived at a dead end, but at the true starting point. The aroma of fresh, strong and welcoming coffee mingled with the smell of dust and herbs, creating a surreal atmosphere in the old kitchen. Sitting at the rustic table, Carolina held the warm cup between her hands, feeling the heat seep into her skin and calm the tremor that still resided within her. Before her, Aunt Lucia chattered softly, her words weaving a vivid and affectionate portrait of Esther. Each shared story was like a brushstroke of color on a gray canvas, revealing her grandmother not only as a family figure, but as the pillar of a community. Carolina listened to how Esther soothed baby's colic with her fennel tea, how she relieved workers' headaches with lavender compresses, and how her lemon balm tea was a balm for anxious souls knocking at her door. "She didn't sell, you know," Lucia explained, with a look that mixed admiration and nostalgia. "She traded. A tea for a good conversation, an ointment for some seasonal fruits, a piece of advice for a smile. She said that healing has no price, that it is an exchange of energy between the earth and the people. This house, my daughter, was a safe harbor for many. Those revelations reshaped everything." Carolina looked around at the walls that had once seemed merely old and now appeared imbued with generosity. The inheritance gained a depth she could barely comprehend. It was not an abandoned property, but a center of affection and care that had been orphaned. When Lucia finally said goodbye, promising to return the next day to help with the cleaning, Carolina felt that a small light had been ignited within her, a fragile yet persistent flame. Alone again, but no longer lonely, she returned to the notebooks. The feeling was different now. It was not just curiosity, it was reverence. She leafed through the pages with an almost liturgical care, absorbing the detailed drawings and precise handwriting. It was then that, nestled among the pages of the first volume, as if patiently waiting to be found, she saw a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax. In elegant and slightly trembling letters was her name: "To my dear granddaughter, Carolina." Her heart raced. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, a single folded sheet of paper, exuding the same herbal scent of the house. Her grandmother's voice seemed to leap from the lines, clear and loving, as if whispering at her side. "My dear Carolina, if you are reading this letter, it is because you have found your way back home. Not to my home, but to yours. I know you may not understand now, and I know your heart is probably heavy. I have watched you from afar for a long time, and saw your spirit wilt, like a plant that does not receive sunlight. I saw the light in your eyes gradually fade, and that pained me more than any illness. That is why I left you this house. Others will see only old walls and a rebellious garden. They will see what has no monetary value. But I left you what is most precious, a purpose. The true legacy is not in the title deed, my granddaughter. It is in these notebooks, in the knowledge they hold. It is in the soil of this garden, which patiently awaits hands to tend it. I left you the independence to bloom, the strength that comes from the earth, and the wisdom to heal, first yourself, and then perhaps others. Do not rush. Learn to listen to the silence of this house. Feel the aroma of each herb. Read these pages not only with your eyes but with your soul. This is your sanctuary now, a place to rediscover and remake yourself, away from the noise that has deafened you. I trust you. I have always trusted you. With all my eternal love, your grandmother, Esther." The tears that Carolina shed were no longer of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of profound relief and overwhelming gratitude. Each word of the letter was a piece that fit into the puzzle of her life, explaining the feeling of displacement, validating her unhappiness, and more importantly, offering her a loving permission to begin anew. Her grandmother had seen her. Esther had truly seen her, behind the facade of a marriage of appearances and a life that did not fit her. Carolina pressed the letter against her chest, feeling a connection with her grandmother stronger than ever. She looked around, and the dust and abandonment transformed into potential. The cobwebs in the corners were merely a sign that life needed to be woven anew. The wild garden was not a daunting task, but an invitation. Esther's letter was not a full stop, but a map. And for the first time in countless years, Carolina felt she knew what the first step in her own journey was. The first morning in Santa Lucia was different from all the other mornings in Carolina's life. There was no jarring sound of the alarm clock, nor the muffled noise of traffic starting to thicken on the avenue. Instead, she was awakened by a soft light filtering through the dusty window cracks, tinting the air with gold. The sound that welcomed her was a rustic symphony, the persistent crowing of a distant rooster, the chirping of birds that had nested on the house's eaves, and the whisper of the wind in the leaves of the garden trees. For the first time in years, she did not wake with a weight on her chest, but with an inner quiet that was both strange and welcome. The previous day had been a whirlwind of emotions, but Esther's letter had acted as a compass, giving her direction. Driven by a renewed energy, Carolina knew exactly where to start. Before deciphering the secrets of the notebooks, she needed to honor the space that had welcomed her. She needed to transform that dormant sanctuary into a home. And so she began the Herculean task of cleaning, which became a ritual of purification, both for the house and for her own soul. She opened all the windows, allowing fresh air and sunlight to flood the rooms, banishing the gloom and the smell of mold. She pulled the white sheets off the furniture with firm gestures, as if unveiling a future. Years of dust floated up, and she fought it with a vigor she didn't know she possessed. She scrubbed the floor, cleaned the windows, polished the wood. Each movement was an act of appropriation. As she swept out the dust and dirt, she felt as if she were also sweeping away the remnants of her past life, the apathy, the hurts, the cruel words of Eduardo. The sweat trickling down her face was real, the fatigue in her muscles was honest, and the satisfaction she felt with each small progress was an immediate and genuine reward, far more gratifying than any superficial praise she had ever received. After hours of intense work inside the house, she turned her attention to the garden, the beating heart of Esther's legacy. Standing on the porch, she observed the chaotic life that spread before her. It was a tangle of weeds, vines and bushes that had grown out of control. But beneath the disorder, she could glimpse the structure of an old care. There was the silhouette of flower beds, the outline of a stone path, and the presence of noble plants like the rose bushes, bravely fighting for their space. It was a daunting task, and for a moment, she felt small in front of it. It was in that moment of hesitation that a soft voice interrupted her. Miss Esther would be happy to see someone taking care of her garden again. Carolina turned and saw a young woman standing by the rusty gate. She had long dark hair tied in a braid and large expressive eyes that conveyed a deep serenity. She carried a small basket with some gardening tools. She was not an intruder. Her posture was one of respect and deference. "You must be her granddaughter," the girl continued with a shy smile. "I'm Letitia. I used to help your grandmother sometimes. We took care of the plants together." The name Letitia sparked a glimmer in Carolina's memory, perhaps from some old conversation with her grandmother. In that moment, she did not see a stranger, but a living link to the past she was trying to decipher. "I'm Carolina. I just arrived." "I know," Letitia said simply. "The whole town already knows. I was hoping you would come." The house missed having people around. She looked at the garden with an intimacy that revealed her affection for the place. "If you don't mind, I can show you where the most stubborn herbs are. Some of them hide pretty well." The offer was made with a delicacy that touched Carolina. It was not a job proposal. It was an invitation to share a secret. "I would love to. To be honest, I don't even know where to start." Letitia smiled, a smile that lit up her face. She entered the garden with the familiarity of someone stepping on sacred ground and walked to a corner seemingly overrun with weeds. With her hands, she gently brushed aside some broadleaves and revealed a lush tuft of a plant with small, fragrant leaves. "Look here," she said, picking a leaf and rubbing it between her fingers before offering it to Carolina. "Mint. Your grandmother said it's good for giving courage." Carolina inhaled the fresh, sharp aroma. In that simple gesture, a bridge was created. The wisdom of the notebooks, the presence of the earth, and the kindness of that young woman came together. Looking at Letitia, who was already pointing to another spot, explaining about a patch of lemon balm, Carolina knew she was no longer alone in her mission. Esther's legacy was not a burden to be carried, but a seed to be cultivated, and she had just found the first and most important partner for this journey. The days that followed unfolded in a new rhythm, a cadence dictated by the sun and the earth. The partnership between Carolina and Letitia blossomed as naturally and organically as the plants they were now tending to. They formed a perfect symbiosis where one's curiosity intertwined with the other's wisdom, creating a strength neither would possess alone. The routine they established was a sacred ritual, a ballet of two people committed to awakening a sleeping giant. Mornings were dedicated to the garden. Under the mild winter sun, which gilded the grass still damp with dew, they immersed themselves body and soul in the task of restoring order to chaos. Letitia was the conductor of that green universe. Her knowledge did not come from books, but from a deep intimacy with nature, a wisdom passed down from Esther, and absorbed through careful and affectionate observation. With a gentle touch, she distinguished the weed from the medicinal herb, teaching Carolina to read the language of plants. "This one," she said, pointing to a velvety leaf, "is boldo. Grandma Esther used to say it talks to the liver." Carolina, in turn, had the eyes of someone discovering the world. With the notebooks in mind, she began to connect the drawings and descriptions of her grandmother with the living plants her hands now touched. "So this is the Plectranthus barbatus she describes on page 12, Carolina murmured, feeling a shiver as she saw the theory materialize in her hands. The work was hard. They dug, hoed, removed stones, and prepared the soil with a compost Leticia learned to make with Esther, using scraps of leaves and peels. For Carolina, each sore muscle at the end of the day was a testament to her effort, a real and productive pain that contrasted violently with the lethargy of her previous life. Her hands, once soft and only accustomed to keyboards and papers, were now calloused and dirty from the earth, and she had never felt so proud of them. In the afternoon, when the sun grew stronger, their sanctuary moved to the kitchen. The space, now clean and organized, had transformed into an alchemical laboratory. It was here that the second act of their collaboration took place. Carolina, with her methodical mind, was the guardian of the notebooks. She read aloud the precise instructions from Esther, deciphering the handwriting, understanding the measurements and times for each process. Leticia was the executor, the artisan. Her movements were fluid and assured, inherited from the memory of having watched Esther countless times. "The notebook says to dry the rosemary branches hung in a dark and airy place," Carolina read. Leticia, without hesitation, was already tying the small bundles with twine, explaining, "Grandma always hung them from the beams in the attic. She said that there they dream undisturbed by the sun." Together, they organized the jars, created new, more legible labels based on Esther's notes, and began processing the first harvests from the revitalized garden. The aroma of the house changed. The smell of dust was replaced by a complex fragrance of lavender, mint, chamomile, and rosemary, the perfume of purpose. On a particularly cold afternoon, they decided to try the first complete recipe, a tea of serenity, which Esther described as a hug for the soul. The recipe called for an exact combination of chamomile, passion flower, and lemon balm. With a nearly childlike reverence, they measured the dried leaves, following the indicated proportions. Water was heated in the old iron kettle, and when poured over the herbs in the cup, the steam that rose carried a promise of peace. They sat at the kitchen table, each holding her cup. The first sip was a moment of silent revelation. The taste was delicate, floral, and deeply comforting. Leticia closed her eyes and smiled. "It tastes like Grandma," she whispered. For Carolina, that tea was more than a drink. It was concrete proof of her ability. It was the result of her work, the embodiment of her heritage, the first fruit of her new life. In that instant, the healing she sought was no longer an abstract concept. It had the flavor and warmth of that tea. Amid the constant dialogue between the ink of the notebooks and the earth of the garden, Carolina and Leticia were not just reclaiming Esther's legacy, they were, unknowingly, beginning to weave their own. The success of the Tea of Serenity was not contained within the walls of the kitchen. The first person to taste it, besides its creators, was Aunt Lucia, who received a small portion in a glass jar tied with a raffia bow as a precious gift. Her reaction was the validation that sealed the duo's confidence. As she tasted the tea, Lucia's eyes filled with tears. "My Holy Mother," she whispered, her voice choked. "It's Esther. The taste is hers. It's like receiving a hug from my old friend." That phrase, laden with emotion and longing, was the greatest reward Carolina and Leticia could have received. The news, as is common in small towns, spread like wildfire. Aunt Lucia told a friend who suffered from insomnia, and Leticia, with Carolina's permission, prepared a small sample of the tea and took it to the neighbor. The result was a peaceful night's sleep, the first in months. Soon, others began to timidly knock on the door of Esther's old house, no longer just out of curiosity, but with renewed hope, seeking relief, comfort, an echo of the wisdom the town so dearly missed. They didn't want to buy. They wanted to share in a memory, in a care. Carolina and Leticia found themselves preparing small amounts of different blends described in the notebooks, each for a specific purpose. They listened to people's stories, their small ailments and big concerns, and felt increasingly connected to that web of lives. It was on one of those afternoons, while transcribing one of Esther's more complex recipes into a new notebook to preserve the original, that an idea began to germinate in Carolina's mind. The notebooks were a finite treasure. The paper was old. The ink could fade. That knowledge was too vast to be confined to just a few dozen pages. "Leticia," said Carolina, looking at her friend who was carefully separating marigold petals, "what do you think about creating a notebook that everyone can read?" Leticia looked at her, confused. "What do you mean, another notebook?" "No, a digital notebook. A place on the internet. A blog," Carolina explained. "We could post photos of the plants we are growing, tell the story of your grandmother, share some of the simplest recipes. That way her knowledge doesn't stay just here. It travels. We honor her spirit, which was about sharing." The idea lit up Leticia's face. She, who had grown up in a world where knowledge was passed down orally and through practice, was fascinated by the possibility of eternalizing her mentor's teachings in such a broad way. Together, they spent the night planning. The name came almost instantly, an obvious and perfect choice, Herbs of Grandma Esther. Carolina, with her familiarity with the digital world, took care of the technical part. Leticia, with her keen eye and sensitivity, helped choose the best photos, those that captured the soul of each plant. The first post was a tribute. It told the story of the house, the unexpected inheritance, and their mission to reclaim the legacy of a wise woman. They published a photo of a steaming cup of serenity tea next to Esther's original notebook. When they clicked the publish button, they felt a mix of euphoria and nervousness. It was as if they were opening the doors of their sanctuary to the world. The initial response was warm and local. People from Santa Lucia and neighboring towns started following the blog, leaving affectionate comments. But then, something unexpected happened. A wellness blogger from a southeastern capital found Herbs of Grandma Esther and was enchanted by the authenticity of the story. He wrote an article praising the project, and the effect was immediate and overwhelming. Overnight, the number of visitors exploded. The comments were no longer just from neighbors, but from people all over Brazil. There were messages from people living in concrete apartments, yearning for a connection with nature, from young people seeking a simpler, more meaningful lifestyle, from those who, like Carolina, felt lost and found inspiration in their story. And with the comments came a new type of question, repeated endlessly. "Do you sell these teas? I need to try. How can I buy them?" Carolina and Leticia stared at the computer screen, stunned. Selling was never the goal. The project was born from love, healing, and sharing. But the demand was undeniable, a chorus of voices asking for a piece of that magic. Standing in the kitchen, with the smell of rosemary in the air and the light of the monitor illuminating their perplexed faces, they looked at each other. The little stream they had found in Santa Lucia was turning into a torrential river, and they would have to decide whether to build a bridge or learn to navigate its waters. The world was knocking at the door, no longer timidly, but with a clear and resounding call. The avalanche of emails and comments transformed the atmosphere of the kitchen. The industrious quiet gave way to a crackling electricity, a mix of panic and euphoria. The question hung in the air, as present as the aroma of chamomile. Should they turn the soul of the project into a product? The hesitation was palpable. Leticia, whose relationship with herbs was of an almost spiritual purity, feared that money could tarnish Esther's legacy. "Grandma traded, she didn't sell," she gently argued, her concern genuine. "She used to say that care has no price." Carolina understood the fear. She herself had fled from a world where everything, even relationships, seemed to have a price tag. The thought of spreadsheets, logistics, and profits sent a chill down her spine. However, she saw something that Leticia might not yet grasp. "But Leticia, we're not talking about getting rich," Carolina countered, with the same delicacy. "We're talking about surviving, about being able to buy new seeds, fix the roof, and dedicate ourselves to this full time. We can do it our way, with our values. We can use money to protect and expand your grandmother's work, not to corrupt it." The discussion was a delicate balance between the purity of purpose and the need for pragmatism. It was amid this dilemma that the past chose to knock at the door with the subtlety of thunder. A shiny, black luxury car stopped in front of the rustic gate, a noisy anachronism on the quiet street of Santa Lucia. From it, Eduardo stepped out. He looked different. The air of disdain was replaced by a slick smile, and casual clothes by an expensive suit that seemed uncomfortable in that setting. He found Carolina in the garden, where she was pruning a rosemary plant. "Carolina, dear, I heard about your project." "Impressive," he said, looking around with the air of someone evaluating an investment. "I always knew you had hidden potential." I came to see if you needed help managing all this, turning this hobby into a real business. Carolina's blood ran cold, but the woman who would have trembled at that tone of superiority no longer existed. She straightened up, pruning shears still in hand, feeling the solidity of the earth beneath her feet. She looked him in the eye, not with anger, but with a cold and cutting clarity. I don't need your help, Eduardo. What we're building here is not a real business by your standards, and frankly, you no longer have the right to call me dear. The firmness in her voice surprised him. He tried to argue, but his words hit a wall of serenity and self-sufficiency. Seeing that there were no gaps, he stepped back, defeated not by a fight, but by the calm indifference of a woman he no longer recognized and could no longer control. Eduardo's visit, as unpleasant as it was, acted as a catalyst. It solidified in Carolina the certainty that she would never again depend on anyone or allow her values to be dictated by others. A few days later, another ghost appeared. Her sister, Fernanda, who had kept the valuable apartment in Sao Paulo, showed up unannounced with a folder full of proposals and spreadsheets. "Sis, I saw your blog. It's a success. I thought about how we can scale this," she said enthusiastically. "We can trademark the brand, create industrial packaging, distribute in major chains. We're going to get rich." Carolina patiently listened to her sister's corporate spiel, and once again, she refused. "Fernanda, I appreciate your concern, but that's not what we want. The value of what we do lies in the fact that it is not industrial. It is in the hands, in the time, in the care. It is in this house." The refusal to ally herself with both Eduardo's opportunism and Fernanda's greed was liberating. They were the last shackles being broken. That night, sitting with Leticia on the balcony under the starry sky of Santa Lucia, the decision finally matured and became clear. "We're going to do this," Carolina said, "but our way." It was then that Leticia, who had been silently observing everything, had the epiphany that would define their future. Her eyes sparkled with a simple yet revolutionary idea. "Carol, what if instead of sending the teas to people, we invited them to come here to have tea?" She pointed to the spacious balcony. "We could set up some tables here. People could come, smell the garden, see where the herbs grow. It would be a tea house, Grandma Esther's tea house." The silence that followed was filled with a feeling of perfection. The idea was brilliant. It was the synthesis of everything. It honored Esther's spirit of hospitality, allowed for a sustainable business model, and protected the soul of the project from massification. Carolina looked at Leticia, then at the balcony, and a wide smile spread across her face. It was not just a business plan. It was the natural evolution of their purpose. They would not only sell teas, they would offer an experience, a refuge. The future, which had once been an uncertain haze, now had the clear and inviting outline of a tea house. The idea of the tea house, once planted, blossomed with a speed and strength that surprised them both. The energy once spent on doubts and hesitations was all channeled into creation. The following months were filled with intense and joyful work. With the help of a local carpenter, they transformed the old balcony into a cozy nook. Small rustic demolition wood tables were sanded and waxed by themselves, each receiving a small vase with a sprig of fresh herbs from the garden. A passion flower vine was guided to climb up the columns, promising shade and flowers for the future. With a sage green paint, Carolina hand-painted a wooden sign that was hung at the entrance. "Tea House, Herbs from Grandma Esther." The inauguration was not a grand event, but a gathering of souls. They simply opened the gate on a sunny Saturday morning. The first to arrive were Aunt Lucia and a small group of neighbors who came with flowers and cakes, turning the opening into a community celebration. Sitting on the porch, tasting the serenity tea and a cornmeal cake with rosemary that Carolina and Leticia had baked, they gazed at the now thriving garden and sighed with contentment. Esther's house was alive again, more alive than ever. The news, propelled by the blog, traveled far. Soon the flow of visitors became constant. They were people from neighboring towns, tourists who diverted their route, and loyal blog readers who traveled miles just to experience that piece of peace. They came in search of teas, but found much more. They found a refuge from the noise of the world, a place where time seemed to run slower. They sat, spoke softly, read books, or simply contemplated the swaying leaves in the garden. The online business also thrived. They created simple and beautiful packaging, and a small room in the house became the shipping center, from where packages of care and affection were sent throughout Brazil. The profit was not exorbitant, but it was more than enough. It paid the bills, allowed reinvestment in the garden, and most importantly, ensured them an independence that Carolina had never dreamed was possible. On an autumn afternoon, with the tea-house bustling and a mild sun bathing the porch, Carolina paused for a moment at the kitchen doorframe, drying her hands on her apron. She observed the scene, Leticia with a smile, explaining to a customer the difference between lemon balm and lemongrass, a young couple reading side by side, hands clasped on the table, Aunt Lucia at her favorite table, knitting calmly. An overwhelming feeling of gratitude flooded her, as warm and comforting as the steam rising from the cups. She finally understood, in all its fullness, the meaning of her grandmother's letter. The true inheritance was not the property, the jars, or even the notebooks. The inheritance was the opportunity. It was the key to a door that would lead her back to herself. Esther's legacy was proof that it was possible to build a purposeful life, a life where work and joy were not opposing things, but intertwined like the vines of the climbing plant on the porch. She looked at her own hands, calloused from the garden and sometimes stained by tea, and saw the hands of a woman who nurtured, cared for, and built. Her gaze met Leticia's across the porch. They smiled at each other, a smile of complicity and deep affection. In that young woman, Carolina found the sister that life had not given her, a partner whose quiet strength was the perfect counterbalance to her own newly discovered determination. They were no longer merely the granddaughters of Esther's legacy. They were its active guardians, its reinvigorators. A visitor approached Carolina, interrupting her reflection. "Excuse me," he said. "I read on the blog about the power of rosemary for memory. Is it true?" Carolina turned to him and a genuine smile lit up her face. "It is," she replied, her voice calm and assured. "Rosemary reminds us of things we thought we had forgotten. Come, I'll make you a tea and tell you its story." In that moment, the cycle was complete. The woman who had arrived there, lost, broken, and voiceless, was now the one offering healing and telling the stories. Esther's legacy was no longer confined to yellowed pages, but bloomed in a garden, in a tea house, and, above all, in the heart of a woman who had finally found her way home.